Today we're making a tiny zigzag single needle Coptic stitch book, but this is a stitch you can actually use on multiple projects. First, it's great to decide the size of your book. So to help us out, I have some handy bottle caps and I have 3 different sizes, and you'll need scrap paper. You'll also need a pencil, a ruler, scissors, and upholstery thread or another small thread. We're also going to be doubling it up when we sew. As far as needles go, normally I use curved needles. For the covers, anything does work, but for ease and because I like it, I'm going to use this plastic canvas. Next, we have to pick the size of our book. That's going to be really hard for you guys to see, so I'm going to go with the yellow one, which is a little bit bigger. So you're going to take your bottle cap or your other template and you're going to trace it onto one of your pieces of scrap paper, just like that. And we're going to cut this out. This will be our template for our covers and the rest of our pages. We're going to fold it in half, and if there's some edges to clean up, go ahead and clean this up since this is our template. When you open it up, you can see the size of your book. Now we're going to grab our covers, we're going to fold our template in half and use it to create the shapes of each cover. Since I'm using plastic canvas, I'm going to use one of my paint pens to trace around my template, and we need 2 covers, so I'll trace it twice. They are a little awkward to cut out, so the first thing I do is cut basic rectangular shapes around them, and then I go back over my line. Just following along the outline I made, and if you're using plastic canvas like I am, you might have to go back and touch them up a little bit, and that's perfectly okay. And then we'll cut out the second cover. Same thing as before, following along the line, double check the size, and if you see any things poking out, just clip them off. If the paint pen line is showing, just a little bit of isopropyl alcohol will remove it, so I'm just wiping it off. And if you have any little pokey edges, you can take a little piece of sandpaper and just hit those edges and they won't be sharp anymore. Now we have our covers. Take your template and double check them. If you like it, you are good to go. So place the covers to the side and let's check our template. What I'm realizing, it is 1 inch wide and it's also 2 inches tall or long, right? So when we open it up though, it fits in a 2 by 2 square because it's a circle, right? What we're going to do is we're going to tear down paper that's a little bit bigger just to give us some wiggle room in case we make a oops. I highly advise you marking your cutting board if you're using one with your paint pen or something else so you have a guide. And now we're going to tear down our paper. If you slightly get off, we're going to be cutting these out anyway. It's no big deal. But I'm tearing all my paper down into 2.5 inch squares. How many pages you tear depends on how big you want your book to be. Next, we're going to fold our pages in half. I'm using a bone folder to help me fold, but if you don't have one, that's totally okay. From the amount of small books I've sewn, I've found that just a few pages at a time works best for me. Today, I'm going to try 2 pages at once. I usually prepare more pages than I really need. Oh, that was a jay feather. His fluffies get everywhere. Usually I prepare more pages than I need. That way, after I've pressed them and I'm going to sew them, I don't have to stop and make more. It's so much easier to cut these out after they've already been pressed. So let's check it with our template. Yep, I think we're good to go. And now we're going to smash them. I like to place a piece of scrap paper down first, and then I lay out all my little pages. These are so small, I'm not stacking them. I'm just laying them in a single layer across the scrap piece of paper, making sure they all fit. And then I'll take another piece of scrap paper and lay it over the top of them. And then I'll pile on books. So I'm just using books that are large enough to cover all my pages. And there you go. I'll leave these overnight. Once the pages are smashed, they'll be so much easier to cut out in the shape that we want. You've waited patiently, and now it's time to remove the books and see our smashed pages. I always love this part. And there they are, ready to go. So now that they're flattened, it'll be so much easier to cut. Gather them up, and then let's cut them out. We will be using the template that we created at the very beginning. Now, if you're like me and you laid it down, you can either trace the cover or you can trace the original object. You'll take that template and lay it over a set of pages. Make sure it's lined up edge to edge, and then just trace it. That's all you're going to do. You'll repeat this for every set of pages. Tap the edge of your pages on the table to make sure they're lined up, and then cut around the line that you traced. Just like before, you'll do this with every set of pages. Let's check them out and see what they look like with the covers, and then you can decide how big you want your book to be. If you prepped extra pages at the start, it's a lot easier to just add more pages if you want your book to be thicker. The next couple items you do not have to do, but what I like to do is go back with an eraser and erase any pencil marks that are left over from tracing my template. So I'm just checking each page and I'm going back and erasing any kind of pencil marks that I find. And I do this on both sides. The next thing I also do on these rounded books is to use sandpaper. Since I'm not tearing the pages, the edges aren't as nice looking. At least I don't think they are with the scissors. So I take just a piece of sandpaper and I rough up all the edges of each set of pages. This knocks down any sharp points created by the scissors. And yes, it takes a little bit, but I think it's worth it. But it's not a necessary step. Bookbinding is a process, and it's finally time to measure and cut the holes. These little books can be difficult to work with, so I found that using a clip to keep things together as I cut the holes works really well. And I'm just lining up the covers and the pages and then clipping it on. We're going to use that template one more time. Line up the ruler and figure out where you want your hole placement. It doesn't really matter where you put your holes. You just don't want them too far apart or too close together. Since I'm doing a zigzag, I am going to put one in the middle, and then I'm also going to mark the edges. I'm going to go in 1/8 of an inch from the outside edge. That's very close. It's probably better to go further in, but that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to mark it on either side. This is where the thread will turn around and come back the other direction. This is important since we're doing a single needle Coptic stitch because the thread runs up and down the length of our book. Now I'm figuring out where do I want my thread to go in the middle, and I'm just making the marks. This actually is for the other side. I know it might look confusing, but I'm figuring out that I want those marks for my zigzag to be in the middle. So now that's what my template looks like, and I'm going to use one template for both sides. I'm going to go back in and put the marks bigger, that way I can see them. We'll take the template, we'll line it up with the edge of our book, and then we're going to use the marks that we made as a guide. So because I'm doing a zigzag, I'm only doing those 3, and then I'm flipping my template over and I'm marking the other side. Because I still need those turnaround points, I'm marking the very edges on both sides, and then I'm also doing the little in-between marks as well. Using a ruler to help get straight lines as I draw out where I'm going to cut. It is helpful to draw it out first with a pencil, just in case when you go to cut, your marks don't show. Now take a craft knife and cut your lines. And I'm not using a ruler as a guide. I got my lines and I'm just kind of winging it. It's a little tough. Go slow so you don't cut yourself and the book. But yep, I'm just clipping through all those pages. I've found that it helps to flip the book around as you work to get the best direction for a cut. Now, before you let go of your pages, go ahead and number them. This way, if they get out of order, you can find which one goes next. And then it's always a good idea to check the holes to make sure the cuts went through. If you need to poke holes in any of them, go ahead and fix that before we sew. You are about ready. We are ready to sew. First, before you start sewing, take your eraser and go erase any pencil marks you see on the edges of your pages. Check your little book one last time, and then an idea to keep you organized is to place your little pages in a container. Then grab your needle. I'm using a very small curved needle. You'll need your thread. Because our thread runs up and down the length of our book, we're going to use the book covers to help measure how much thread we need. It's no big deal if you run out, but I kind of like to estimate. So for each cover, I pulled across twice, so that's 4 pulls, and then I pulled across for each set of pages. So I have 2 covers and 10 sets of pages. That's me pulling across my thread 14 times. And then I usually pull some more because I don't like to run out. Next, we'll wax our thread. So grab your beeswax and you're going to run the thread between your thumb and the beeswax, and the friction will cause the beeswax to melt onto your thread. This is not a necessary step, but it does make the thread grab the pages a little better. Then we'll thread our needle. I'm doubling up my thread for the sewing, so I'll take the ends together and tie them in a knot. That way they stay even. Time to sew the cover. So you can start from the front or the back. Either way, you're going to take the first signature that you're going to use, put it up, and take your needle and go through the first hole on the inside of your signature. Pull the knot until it's all the way up in the crease. Then set on your cover. Take your needle and go through the hole in your cover and back between the first signature and the cover itself. Usually I loop to the outside, but really it doesn't matter. Either side of the thread is fine. Next, we're going to take our needle and we're going to go between the cover and the signature and loop around that thread that first went through the very first hole. So if your book is round and if it slips like mine did, take a second and just readjust it. It's no big deal. Just remember, we're catching that initial thread. You know, the one that poked through the hole and looped the cover? That's what we're looping around. Once you do that, you can wiggle it a little bit and tighten it up, and that has made our first connection. Then take your needle and go back through the first hole, the signature. This will place your needle back on the inside. Pull the thread all the way in, and then if you like, you can tie a knot with the very end of the thread. Now we move on to the second hole. Take your needle and go through the hole, and then once again, we're going to loop around the outside of the cover into the hole in the cover that we want to use and back between the cover and the signature. I'm still staying to the right, but really it doesn't matter. You can go either way. Then take your needle and wrap back around the thread that originally came out that second hole. Tighten it up and go back through the hole in the signature. This places your needle back on the inside. You'll repeat this step for the third hole. So go in the last hole and you're going to pull the thread all the way in. Then go through the hole in the top of your cover and back between the cover and that signature. So go slow. It's wanting to catch the edge of that semicircle. Tighten it up. And then next we're going to loop back around the thread that attached the cover to the signature, just like the previous two holes. The thread should remain on the outside. Do not go back into that signature. We're grabbing the next one. So we're grabbing signature number 2. And you're going to take your needle and go through the very first hole on that second signature. Pull the thread all the way, and then you're going to go back through the next hole. This is a hole that is very close together, so make sure that you do not pull it too tight or it'll cut your paper. Pull the thread all the way through, and now it's time to link our signatures. We're going to link between the cover and the first signature. So open up the book and take your needle and loop around that thread that connects the cover to the first signature. Pull the thread all the way, then take your needle and go back through the hole. Now we're back on the inside of the signature. We're off to the next hole. Poke your needle through. You're going to loop around that thread between the cover and the first signature. So open up the book if you need to. You can see it a lot easier. Take your needle and loop around that thread. I like to go with a loop that follows the direction I'm going. So I'm looping around and I'm coming back on the other side, and then I'm going back into the same hole that I just came out of. Open up the book if you need to. So back through the same hole, and there it is. I'm pulling it in, and then we're going back into the hole immediately after this one. So they're right next to each other because this is the point of the zigzag. Then we're going to take that needle, go between the cover and that first signature, and loop around the thread that connects the cover. And then right back into the hole, just the same way we did before. The process repeats on the next hole. Go ahead, place it in the next hole, and then you're going to loop around the thread that connects the cover, and then go right back in the hole once again. For every inside hole in the signature, it's the same process until we get to the very end. This one is a little different. Just like normal, go through the last hole and pull the thread all the way out. I hate my camera cut off, but that's okay because now the most important part you'll be able to see. The thread is on the outside. Before we add the next signature on, we're going to loop around the opposite direction, pull your thread, and you're not pulling all the way. What you're doing is you're pulling until it makes a little loop. We are creating a kettle stitch. So see the loop right there? We're going to take our thread and we're going to go back up through the loop. It creates a little knot at the end of your signature, which keeps everything nice and tight. Now you're grabbing the next signature. This is signature number 3. So we're going to repeat the entire process, but from the opposite direction. So now that you're inside the signature, we're going to go out the next hole, and then we're going to loop around the thread. But this time we're looping between the first and the second signature. So loop around that thread that connects the signatures together and back into the hole of the current signature that you're sewing. Now we're working our way down the book and going to the next hole. Poke your needle through and pull the thread all the way out. So this is where it gets a little tricky because you're trying to loop that thread between the first and second signature without catching an additional thread. So you're looping around that thread because it makes a V. It's a little tricky. And then you're going to go back in the current signature in the same hole that you exited out of. And then we're going to repeat the process for the next hole. The middle part is really tricky. Exit out, and then you're still looping around the first and second signature. So it's really hard. A curved needle does help, but you're going to stick it between those two threads and loop around and go right back in that hole. The process repeats for the next hole, and it's still a tight squeeze because there's two right next to each other. So you're going to poke it through the hole, loop around between the first and second signature, and then stick it back in the hole you just came out of. It might take you a couple signatures, but once you get in the rhythm, you'll go out of the hole, you'll loop around one signature below and back through the hole, and then it just repeats. The only thing that changes is when you get to the very end of a signature, you're going to loop around the opposite direction, still going one signature below and linking that thread, and then instead of going right back into the hole, you're creating this little loop to create a kettle stitch and going up through the loop to create a knot and then back into the next signature. Place your needle through that next signature, pull it all the way through, and then the process repeats. Out a hole, link the thread one signature below, and then go back into the hole, pull it out, and then back into the next hole. Where the threads are very close together, sometimes you have to make a really big loop and take the needle all the way through between the signatures and then back out between the threads. Sometimes that helps. When you're creating a zigzag design, once the holes are more spaced out, it gets a lot easier. You'll get into a rhythm, and just remember you're going to go out a hole, go down one signature below, loop the thread, and then back into the hole. And then move on to the next hole and repeat. The only thing that changes is when you get to the very end of the signature. Just remember, on the very last hole, you're always looping the opposite direction and going back up through the loop that you created to create a little knot, which is called a kettle stitch, and then going into the next signature. If this gets too confusing, you can just leave out the kettle stitch and just do a normal loop. But there you go. The zigzag design will build up as you go. So you'll go into the next signature, pull the thread through, and then go through the next hole to the outside of the signature, pull the thread all the way through. Sometimes the double thread gets a little tangled, but go slow, it'll go through, and then loop around that next thread. Remember, you're still going one signature below, pull the thread, and then you're going to go back into the hole of the signature. And then you'll move on to the next hole. Go through the next hole, pull the thread, loop around one signature below, then go back up into the hole. By this time, you're getting into a rhythm. This stitch can be used for multiple books, not just this design. So as long as you remember to loop down one signature below before returning back into the current signature you're working on, you are doing it. And you don't always have to double up your thread. For tiny books such as this, the thicker bookbinding thread is really chunky and sometimes makes the book fly open even more. So this is smaller thread, but normally I don't double up my thread, which makes this process so much easier. Because now see, like I'm fighting that double thread, and that's okay. So remember, when you get to the end of the signature, we are still making the kettle stitch. This just adds an extra amount of tension on the book and keeps it together tighter. So you're going to go back through the opposite direction and then take that needle and go through the loop that the thread made. And it's easier sometimes if you just place the thread over the needle, pull it tight, and then you're ready for the next signature or the cover. Little books are really hard to handle and they want to pop open, and so it's useful to have a clip to clip all the pages together. We are sewing the last signature with the cover. So you need your last signature and the cover, and you'll stack them and place them on top of your pages. So the first step is to take your needle and go through the top of your cover in between the cover and the last signature. So you can see it's between the cover and last signature. Then you'll loop around the next signature down. So we're catching the last thread that we sewed. We're looping around the next to last signature, And then we're going to go back into the hole of the current signature that we're wanting to sew, which is the very last one. Then go through the next hole. This time, I'm going to show you looping around the signatures first. So, first step, you're going to take your needle and you're going to loop around the thread connecting the next to last signature. So I'm looping around, it's getting a little tight. We're making the V of the zigzag. And then I'm going to go through my cover, pulling the needle through, and then I'm looping the thread that connects the cover, and I'm going between that last signature in the cover and looping that thread, and this makes a little loop around it. It'll help tighten it up, and then I'm going to loop that next thread on the next signature down, and what this does, it creates the V. The threads are a little tight, and so go slow, it's a little tough, and then next step is you'll go back into that last signature. Then we move on to the next hole and repeat the process. So go through the hole, pull your thread all the way through, and then you're going to loop around that first thread between the next to last signature and the last one. Catch that thread and then go through the cover. Remember, you're going between the cover and that last signature. So loop through the cover and pull your thread, and then we're looping around that thread that connects the cover. It's a little hard to hold on to and pull it tight. And then we're going to loop down the thread just below, and we're going between the next to last signature and the last one. I got a little bit out of the frame, but it's the same process as the last one. So once you've made it through between the signatures, you're going back through the hole, and then we're down to the last hole. We are almost done. So you're going to go out that last hole, and you're going to go through the cover, and then I'm going to loop the thread on the next to last signature that connects the very last one, and then I'm going back into the hole of the last signature. And we are officially done. It's time to tie off your book. So how I tie mine off is I make a couple little half hitches. So what you do is you take your thread and you loop it back through the thread inside the book and pull it through the loop it makes. And I do that a couple times, and then we're done. So there's your little book. And it's not perfect, but it sure is cute. And it does, boop, want to pop open. And so what you can do is tie a little extra piece of thread to create a latch or closure. And I like to leave a little bit of tail on mine and for a bookmark, and I clip it off. So there you go. Congratulations. You have now learned a stitch that you can use on multiple books, not just teeny tiny ones. Great job. Thanks for watching. And as always, happy arting.